Hi, I'm John, and I'm a film editor for StoryKeep. One of my favorite projects that I've worked on was editing a series of stories shared by the friends and family of a gentleman who'd been suffering from dementia. We wanted to give this gentleman a way to reconnect with friends and family and the memories he still had of them. As I worked on the edit, I heard heartfelt testimonials from so many people whose lives had been touched by this man that I really came to appreciate what a rich life he'd led. And I was especially moved by the last video in the series from his wife, which was full of detailed memories and was remarkably tender. And I took pleasure in knowing that this video would be deeply meaningful to this gentleman. If this sounds interesting for your family or one you support, please be in touch with us.
Welcome to Who We Remember. I'm Jamie Younger, the founder of StoryKeep, and your host for this podcast. It is wonderful to have you here joining us for the show. This is a place where we have uncommon conversations about things that matter deeply, the people that we love, and the purpose that we give to our own lives and legacies. Our mission at StoryKeep is to capitalize on the power of story for profound good in families of wealth. Since 2010, we've partnered with over 100 families worldwide, creating personal films and private podcasts that celebrate a family's shared narrative. Our work is defined by deepening connections. The conversations on this podcast center around two questions. The first one is, whose life story from your own family would you most want to see documented? And the second is, what are you as a person and as a professional hoping to create and leave behind? Today, I'm honored to welcome David York to the show. David is an attorney, CPA, and managing partner at Howell, an estate planning law firm in Salt Lake City, Utah. For the past 28 years, he has worked with high net worth clients on their estate, business, and charitable planning. Today, David is going to tell us an incredible story about his own life and his father, Gary York. David didn't know for the vast majority of his life that his father was not his biological father. The story of his paternity is pretty remarkable. We'll be diving into that story and David's thoughts on his own life and legacy in this podcast episode. So please settle in for my intimate conversation with David York as we explore the enduring influence of his father, Gary, the one that he always knew, and the legacy that David is building for himself. David, I have to say it's such a pleasure to sit down and hear the stories and memories about your dad, which is such an incredible story, truly. Some people know it, some people, this will be the first time. So you wanted to talk about your dad, Gary York, and I feel like we maybe should start the story when you were 49, but you tell me if you want to start at another place.
No, that's a perfect spot. It's 49. Remember exactly where I was. I was actually at Disney World at the very start of a family trip with my family, and it was about 5 years after my dad had passed away, and I don't know, year and a half before, I had done one of those 23andMe, where you send off some saliva and find out about yourself. And I found out that I'm Caucasian. So that was, very diverse. I'm only 97% Northern European, and you find out these little quirks and things about you. There's some fascinating things you learn about temperament and traits and characteristics that you have, more in your DNA than you think, but didn't think much of it. And then I'd gotten an email saying, hey, there's a new medical test that had come out. Do you want to find out about it? So I thought, it's morning, everybody's still sleeping. And so I went on there and it said, do you want to know if you have this medical condition? I said, yes. And they said, are you sure? I said, yes. I said, you can't unknow this. I like, yes. And then it came back and said, you don't have it. So it was kind of anticlimactic.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then on there, it had a thing where it said, you have new relatives. Would you like to see relatives on there? And I was like, oh, just curious if there's like a first cousin living near me or something like that. And so I clicked on it, and you can sort by relationship, closest relationship. So I sorted the closest relationship. And at the very top was a person I hadn't never recognized. And it said genetic match, 49.6% predicted relationship, father. And it was not my dad. And it was, shocking. It's one of those like, okay, this has got to be a mistake. And I logged out, logged back in.
Oh, you logged out.
Yeah, I logged out. I'm like, this is like they messed it up somehow. So I log out, then log back in, and this person's still there. So I'm like, well, this has got to be a mistake. But so I Googled the name, and it popped up that he was an OBGYN resident, had like his life history at the same hospital I was born at, the year I was born there. And I was like, well, that's a strange coincidence that there's some random person, and started.
You found this within a matter of a few minutes, just
oh yeah, a few minutes. Yeah, I'm
okay.
Yeah, and so I called my wife, and she was in the other room, and she came in and looked at it, and she goes, well, this is a scam. Like, this is some kind of mistake or some kind of scam. And but the more I looked into the backstory, and the more I thought about it, I kind of analogize it to that scene in like an M. Night Shyamalan, or like a mystery where there's all these little things, and then suddenly there's this moment where you just have total clarity, and you look back, and all these little things that didn't make sense add up. And at the one hand, I was completely shocked, and on the other hand, it made perfect sense. And so fast forward a couple of days, we get back home from the trip. I was more than a little. I was there's this children's book about a goose that gets raised by ducks,
Yeah.
and they like walking around. I always felt a little strange and wondering, like, are you my mommy? Are you my mommy? I'm literally walking through Disney World, wondering who if I'm related to anybody who's walking past me. Like, is that my sister? Is that my brother, my aunt? Like, so long story short, came home and talked to my mom, and she and my dad had struggled to conceive for years, and ended up going to a clinic. And at the time, that was before IVF or any of those other things. So they would oftentimes just have a stand-in. They would go grab a
stand-in.
Stand-in. They would go and get a sample from someone at the clinic, oftentimes an intern or a resident or something like that. And that's what they did. And they got pregnant, and they never told anybody, and they didn't tell me. And so it was kind of funny. Halfway through this conversation with my mom, she said, she goes, I've been meaning to tell you.
Oh.
I'm 49 years old, and
did you
I've had some health
issues. What was your emotion when she said that?
I just kind of laughed, because the thing is, I've had some heart issues. I actually had a bout of cancer. Part of that, all treated, and I'm doing well. But in there, you go through and list your family history. Like family history is huge part of that. I literally had to go back to all my doctors and be like, okay, cross off half of what I told you is totally wrong. And I'm like, those could have been good times to bring this out. But on the one hand, and and we can live in these dualities. On the one hand, I think it was something that both my parents knew, obviously, and I can't help but think that it affected things. On the other hand, I think they didn't think about it either. So, you know, one of the things that's like, while it made so much sense on the one hand, it was so shocking on the other. And then to that, I give my parents credit. Like I was shocked. And
So it
so,
felt fully enveloped and fully loved, and there
oh
was
yeah,
no
yeah, yeah.
otherness.
And um, it, what it did explain was that in so many ways, I am just like my dad. I tell jokes like him. He was a CPA. I'm a CPA. He started his own business. I started my own business. I walk like him. I literally shuffle. My wife can see me from a half a mile away from how I walk. I walk exactly like my dad walked. And in other ways, totally different. Just absolutely different. He was tall and skinny and black hair, and I was short and chubby and redhead. I was literally the redheaded stepchild. Like I did, I was like I should have realized that. Blonde, blue eyes, and temperament, very, very different. Very, but I kind of took that more that I was like my mom.
Yeah, you made the
And
story work.
exactly, exactly.
Right.
But it's that whole nature nurture, right? And so I could kind of feel that within me, the nature side and the nurture side. And so it while it was completely discombobulating on the one hand, it also helped make sense of so many things on the other hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, um, this is like kind of a interesting woven story of you and your dad, right? Where does it start? Where does it end of the beginning of the relationship of the you two? But I want to go back and ask you about who your dad was, because you chose him as the person where you said this is the person whose life story I would want to document. And one of the things you mentioned is sort of who he was and the sacrifices that he made, basically for, I guess, for you and your family and your siblings growing up. So tell me about who Gary was and sort of his dreams and what he ended up doing with his life.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, who he was uh is something I found out over time, right? And so some of this I knew, some of this I didn't realize until very late in his life. But he grew up incredibly poor, just in a very, very poor family. His father had a seventh grade education, worked in an axe handle factory. So he worked hard manual labor um, every day, or 6 days a week, working in a hickory axe handle factory as they moved through the South. Um, my grandmother had two children, and then her husband passed away, and then had married my grandfather, and so my dad was the youngest, and kind of a stepchild, but a stepchild. Well, he had step siblings, but grew up very, very poor in the South, and his dad saw education as the only way out of poverty. And so, my dad did not really have a choice in getting an education. Like it was uh, non-optional. And part of what's funny is my grandfather refused to teach my dad anything about tools, equipment. He was very, very handy. He could fix anything. He did not want my dad to learn any manual labor, any manual skills, and I learned all of that from my dad. So I'm completely incompetent when it comes to fixing anything. But it was like this intentional, I'm intentionally not going to teach you this because you need to get an education. And then my dad when it came time to college, he was the first York to go to college. The town that they lived in, essentially there were 2 degrees. You could be an accountant or you could be a teacher. And that was it. And my dad didn't want to be a teacher. So he became an accountant. And for 4 years, they couldn't really afford to send him to college. So they rented out his rooms. My dad slept on the couch for 4 years so that they had enough money to go to college. And I remember growing up, we had we would have Campbell's soup, the condensed soup.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that condensed soup meant that you added water to it because my dad never added water to condensed soup. Like I didn't know what that meant. And so I always just put the soup in because that's what he did. Well, I didn't find out till years later that on Sundays they would have a ham, and then the rest of the week they had soup, and they kind of lived off the broth. Basically, they had broth for a week. So he had such runny soup; it was really more broth to get by, and so he hated uh, runny soup.
He wanted a stew.
He wanted a stew. Yeah, he wanted a stew, and they grew up on a soup. And I grew up in this middle class environment where we weren't rich, but when I went to the refrigerator, there was food. If my pants tore, they got me another pair. Like that was my life experience. That was my mom grew up middle class. Her dad was an engineer. And so it's those little things of poverty and growing up in poverty. And so my dad had such a fierce, like same thing. You're going to get an education. You're going to go to school. But I didn't really understand it till later, how much that poverty affected him and how frustrated he would get at the opportunities that I had that I kind of was cavalier about, because of that.
Can you remember something that you were cavalier about?
Oh yeah. Well, cavalier about education, I was average to below average student. And, in fact, it was funny. He used to always, he gets so mad at my grades, and he's like, you're going to grow up and you're going to be a ditch digger. Like you're going to be a ditch digger. And I had no idea what a ditch digger was. Like I mean, we grew up in Salt Lake, and I had never actually even seen a ditch. And I'm like, who would dig a ditch? Why would you dig a ditch? Like, but yeah. And, but then I went to college and got an accounting degree. But yeah, I could see that in him. And then again, just not appreciating those little things. Like to me, having food and being able to eat or being able to go on a family trip, you presume these things, and so all he wanted was to give his kids an opportunity because he had such limited choice.
This brings me so curious now hearing these stories. You had shared earlier with me that on Christmas you had these deck of cards, which I think you have with you,
Yeah.
like next to you. Like you can feel free to I'm curious. Can you talk about this and like what you learned about your dad through these cards that you presented to him?
Yeah, so it was interesting. A couple of things converged at the same time. One, I do estate planning. I help people with wealth transfer. And for years, my law partner and I had seen so much failed wealth transfer. We saw heirs stripped of purpose. We saw addictions fed. We saw families in absolute dysfunction, destroyed by wealth and wealth transfer. And so we started to look at, okay, what are the characteristics of families that do successfully transfer wealth? What do they have in common? And the number one thing we found among families that most successfully transfer wealth in all its forms. And when I say wealth, I don't mean just financial. I mean human capital, social capital, spiritual capital, all those kind of things. Number one characteristic is they know who they are, what they value, and what they believe. They have a clear sense of identity that leads to how they invest their time, their talent, and their treasure. They resource what they value. And so I'm recognizing this. We're writing actually a book on this, and I recognize I don't even know what I value. Like heck, I'm a lawyer. Maybe I don't even have values. And so I actually developed a card game that was designed for couples, families, even individuals to play to try to understand what are their core values, what are those things that make them tick. And the reality is, we all have core values. Very few of us actually know and I can identify what those are. So we created this game. In the exact same time this is going on, my dad is diagnosed with cancer, ultimately terminal cancer, and that occurs in like September 2015. Passed away in May of 2016. And so I'm developing this card game and trying to help all these people. So after the card game was developed on Christmas morning of 2015, I sat down with my parents and played this game. And it was really fascinating because, we would get to core values like determination, productivity, entrepreneurism, and these kind of driver productive values. And it was born out of that. I never wanted to be poor. I had to work my way out of poverty, and I wanted to provide my family opportunities. It was funny. We would get to other cards like empathy, and he would just go, nah. uh, uh, and artistry. He's like, nah. It just was kind of funny. And it, not that people don't value those things, but there's things that are just integral to who they are. And so all of his values were in that kind of productive quadrant. And I had grown up thinking, oh, my dad's a workaholic. Oh, my dad, is just a driver. He cares about the business. But it was born out of this just, and part of that determination is he shared some stories of how poor he was. Like, he used to share at Christmas. He was like, when I was a kid, I only got an apple. I got an apple for Christmas. I thought that was a joke. I thought that, oh, he's kind of exaggerating.
Yeah.
He got an apple for Christmas. Like, that's what he was given because that's all they could afford. And so I think it was that, again, knowing what he went through and how he saw my life, and then me going back and seeing that, it's like a lot of things made sense, and the sacrifice that he made so that his kids could have it better than he did. I had not seen that till I saw the genesis of those core values.
You do such a beautiful job of giving an example of how values are embedded in story,
Yeah.
right? Like that the story is sort of the color and the scene and the characters that really show us how those values show up, and
Yeah.
dance
Well,
too.
yeah. And here's the thing that I've learned in my time of looking at values and talking with people. Some of our values, I just call the fingerprint of God. They're there. We've always been that way. We've always been loyal. We've always had, we've always loved artistry, whatever it is. But a lot of our values are actually born from life experience, and more often than not, through difficulty. We value integrity because we dealt with someone who lacked integrity. We value generosity because we are in an incredibly difficult position and someone was generous with us. You look at the story of Jean Valjean in Les Mis, and he has this experience of grace, unmerited grace from the bishop when he steals from, that covers up for him. And it's transformative for his whole life. Like his whole life becomes care and provision of others because of this experience of grace. And so, um, and I think for many of us, we haven't found the headwaters of these values, and in going back and doing that, we recognize the story that we have, and that makes us who we are. And I think it's such a valuable thing. And I think we've lost that introspection so often.
So, given what you've just shared about so many of the things that you live through in your life and the people and the interactions that you've had sometimes inform what you value, can you see a through line in how your dad was and who he was that impacted and informed your values?
Oh yeah, yeah, and in a lot of different ways. Um, in my uh, approach to business, the one of the biggest things that he did is he taught me to serve people. Um, that he everyone he worked with, he tried to help them, and it wasn't always to his economic benefit or return. He just wanted to serve, and in that way, then he let everything else sort itself out. And that's kind of the approach that I've taken. I really try to take the long game and just try to help people and serve people. Um, and I think it does come to your economic benefit long term. But people know the difference between you trying to care for them and help them versus trying to engage in a business transaction or trying to make money off of someone or something else. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's funny because we get to the generosity card and he'd be like, nah. He was actually a very, very generous person. He was very, very generous. And um so yeah, a lot of what I've tried to do is an emulation of that. And at the same time, biologically, I also still feel very, very different. Like he and I just in many ways saw the world very, very differently. And so it's this interesting mix of um for good and for ill,
Yeah.
picking up those things, but then doing so in a bit different shell. Um I actually think was to my benefit, and it allowed me to get at some of the key characteristics of him, and but then not have some of the struggles and trials. He battled anger and frustration and um uh that that drive to achieve, um and so I really do appreciate that. And then, like I said, I the fact that I was so shocked by it was at once both disconcerting and like, wow, well done. Like I had I had no idea. I had no
Yeah.
idea.
You shared with me that, which I thought was remarkable, that you and your wife, in addition to biological children, you also have adopted children. And did learning of your own paternity, what did that do inside of you in relationship to your own children?
It was it was amazing. Because honestly, after shock of the information, one of the first emotions I felt was joy. It was just absolute joy, and it's because uh, I I know my dad as my dad, and that information didn't change it at all. And I have three adopted children that they are my children. Like there's just no difference. I just don't think of it any different. But in some ways you worry, do the kids feel different? Now
Yeah.
theirs is a different situation. They're all from China. And we were always very open with them. Well, one, not that we couldn't be,
Yeah.
like it was going to become obvious at some point.
Yeah.
But, I was just one of those that, yeah, Yorks come different ways. And I always felt like they were always Yorks. Their personality, their temperament, they were born somewhere else, but they were always meant to be Yorks. But
Mm.
the joy I felt was the hope that my children feel the same way, that I am totally their dad. Like there's no, because that's exactly how I feel. And that, especially in the world that we live in today, where there's so many people who have tough biology, tough life circumstances, recognizing that your family is who loves you and that who you love, and the quality of family is the quality of that love. And I think that it really helped me, not that I was overly concerned about it, but as a adoptive parent, I know how I feel about all my kids, but do they feel the same way? And I got that sense too. So it really did help me feel a kinship to my children, that genetics just is, it's a small part of what makes family family.
Yeah. I imagine that at least personally informs the way you think about estate planning and who's in and who's out, and it at
Yeah.
least gives you a perspective to share with
Yeah.
clients, I
Yeah,
would imagine.
absolutely. Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering now that time has passed, um, with your dad, being gone and more time with your own children and your profession, like what you would now want to say to him.
Yeah. I have this vision, this image when we, of stepping into heaven, getting to have a conversation with him, and thought about how it would go and what I would say. And
Mhm.
first thing is I'd say is, you got me. Like you, you got, I never knew. Like, man, you pulled like, credit to you. Um, and I mean that in a good way. Like,
Yeah.
again, that shocking part. The other thing I would say is, thank you. Um, I think we so presume our existence. We're just, we're here, we exist, like we have some right to exist. And that I think we fail to realize that the sacrifice that people made, the work and effort that goes into us existing, and part of what I went through is just an incredible gratitude that I even exist. Like my parents could have like, oh, it's not in the cards for us. It's not going to happen. Let's live our lives and whatnot. No, they went through it. And then to a certain extent, my dad, saying, okay, look, I can't have child, uh, for him to allow my mom, I don't know how some people might feel about that. Hey, is that some kind of impact on me, or what does
Mhm.
that mean? He wanted to have a child. In fact, I shared this with you earlier when we had a conversation. He was a great drummer. He was an all-state drummer in high school, and he actually had a chance to go be in a band and, you know, be in um, the next Beach Boy or whatever. But he recognized, like in high school, that hey, I wouldn't be able to take care of a family, and he really wanted to have a family.
Mhm.
And so he decided, part of his dad's like, you have to have a good education, and him being an accountant, but part of it was, I want to be able to provide for a family. So the fact that the work and the effort that they went through, I'm just grateful for. And I think we need to stop presuming our existence and presuming our right to be here, and recognize that it was a privilege and a sacrifice that someone made. And so, I would say thank you for that as well. And um, there's no frustration. There's just a gratitude for it.
Hmm. Interesting that your dad made these consequential decisions. Like he made that decision, okay, I'm not gonna be a drummer. And then later being confronted with, okay, I want to have a child and I can't, in let's say the typical fashion. And
Yeah,
again, made that, I mean, it's sort of the courage to keep making those decisions for the life you want.
yeah, yeah. And then part of me wonders if he didn't share the information with me because of how I might react to it. And might there be some kind of level of rejection or something like that? And
Mm-hmm.
we're I'm like all people. I had my issues and frustrations and with my dad for sure. There's many things we didn't see eye to eye on. But I remember after he passed away driving home and just saying, I'm glad he was my dad. I'm so glad he was my father with the issues and the troubles and the beauty and the values and everything else. I'm just so glad. And I would let him know that nothing about this would have changed that. But I worry a bit that maybe they kept that from me because that there would be some sense of rejection. So I'd want to address that as well.
Hmm. Yeah. I think he hears you.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think so. Uh, and so that's maybe the one regret is not being able to let him know that. But I still actually believe that there's time for that to come.
Yeah. Well, and you know, if the energy is working correctly, I think he already it's like it's there, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
It's there. Um it's really such a pleasure to hear your story and to learn about your dad through this conversation, David. I thank you for sharing him with me and with everyone who's listening.
yeah. No, I really appreciate it and appreciate the chance and hopefully it's helpful, especially to people who might be in a similar situation. It's rare, but it's not unheard of. And as I've shared that my story, I've run into many other people with similar stories and similar experiences. So hopefully there's value there.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Really
Hmm.
appreciate it.